For the first time in this country's history, an openly transgender woman was executed in the state of Missouri. Amber McLaughlin died by lethal injection. She was serving time for stalking.
Bonne Terre, Missouri, January 3, 2023. At 6:51 p.m., Amber McLaughlin was executed by lethal injection at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center. She was 49 years old, and with her death, she became the first openly transgender woman ever executed in the United States. The case captured national and international attention, not only because of Amber's identity, but because of the crime that placed her on Missouri's death row. Nearly 2 decades earlier, in 2003, she had brutally murdered her former girlfriend, Beverly Guenther, in a crime fueled by obsession, stalking, and rage. The story of Amber McLaughlin is one of trauma, violence, and controversy. Her childhood was scarred by abuse and neglect. Her adulthood was marked by broken relationships, criminal behavior, and untreated mental illness. And her final years became a lightning rod for debate. Supporters arguing she was a product of lifelong trauma who deserved mercy, while others insisted the punishment fit the crime. On that January evening, Amber's final moments unfolded in stark contrast to the horror of her past. Her last meal was a simple McDonald's combo, a cheeseburger, fries, and soda. And when asked for her final words, she expressed remorse and regret, apologizing for the harm she had caused. Her execution reignited fierce discussions about the death penalty, gender identity, and whether a person's past can ever explain but never excuse their actions. For Beverly Guenther's family, it marked the end of a 20-year fight for justice. For the rest of the world, it raised haunting questions about crime, punishment, and mercy in modern America. Amber McLaughlin was born in 1973 in Missouri, assigned male at birth, and originally named Scott. From her earliest years, her life was marked by neglect, instability, and pain. Court records later revealed that Amber's childhood was shaped by severe abuse, including physical mistreatment from her adoptive father and emotional abandonment at home. As a young child, she was placed in foster care, where she bounced from placement to placement. Teachers and caregivers noted troubling signs, frequent emotional breakdowns, learning difficulties, and an inability to form secure attachments. She struggled academically and socially, often feeling isolated and rejected. By her teenage years, Amber had begun showing signs of serious mental health issues. She attempted self-harm multiple times, was hospitalized on several occasions, and was eventually diagnosed with depression and intellectual disabilities. Reports also documented possible brain damage from head trauma in her youth, further complicating her emotional and behavioral struggles. Her early life offered little stability. Instead of consistent support or treatment, Amber grew up with unresolved trauma, bouncing between institutions and unstable homes. By adulthood, she carried deep scars of neglect, low self-worth, and untreated mental illness. As an adult, Amber struggled to find direction. She held only sporadic employment, lived a transient lifestyle, and found herself in relationships often marked by volatility. She began using alcohol heavily, further clouding her judgment and deepening her struggles. These early years, the abuse, the neglect, the untreated trauma, shaped the foundation of Amber McLaughlin's life. While none of it excused the crime she would later commit, it provided a lens into how a broken childhood can grow into a destructive adulthood. By 2003, Amber's life had spiraled into obsession and violence. That November, it would culminate in the murder of Beverly Guenther, the crime that sealed her fate. The crime. On the night of November 20th, 2003, a tragic crime unfolded in St. Louis County, Missouri. The victim was 45-year-old Beverly Guenther, a woman who had spent months living in fear of her former partner, Amber McLaughlin. Their relationship had ended badly, and Beverly had already taken legal steps to protect herself. She obtained a restraining order after repeated stalking, threats, and harassment by Amber. Friends and coworkers later testified that Beverly lived in constant fear, sometimes asking others to walk her to her car after work. That evening, as Beverly left her job at a St. Louis office building, Amber lay in wait. Beverly was ambushed in the parking lot, forced into her own vehicle, and driven to a remote location along the Mississippi River. There, Amber attacked her, stabbing her multiple times. Beverly's body was left near the riverbank, hidden in the brush. When Beverly failed to return home that night, her boyfriend immediately reported her missing. Police began a search, and the next day her car was discovered abandoned. Soon after, Beverly's body was found near the river. Investigators quickly connected the crime to Amber. The restraining order, the history of harassment, and eyewitness accounts all pointed toward her. When questioned, Amber eventually confessed, admitting she had committed the murder in a fit of rage and obsession. The killing of Beverly Guenther sent shockwaves through her community. It was a brutal reminder of how patterns of stalking and abuse can escalate into lethal violence, even when victims take legal steps to protect themselves. For Beverly's loved ones, the restraining order had not been enough. For prosecutors, the evidence was clear. Amber McLaughlin had deliberately and fatally targeted her former partner. Arrest and evidence. In the days after Beverly Guenther's murder, investigators quickly pieced together the case against Amber McLaughlin. Beverly's restraining order had already documented months of stalking and harassment, making Amber the primary suspect from the start. Detectives recovered blood evidence in Beverly's abandoned vehicle, which tied back to the crime scene. Witnesses also reported seeing Amber near Beverly's workplace on the night she disappeared. Phone records and prior police reports revealed a disturbing pattern of unwanted contact in the weeks leading up to the murder. When police questioned Amber, the pressure mounted. Eventually, she gave a full confession, admitting she had ambushed Beverly in the parking lot, forced her into the car, and driven her to the river where the fatal attack took place. The confession aligned with the physical evidence, leaving little room for doubt. The murder weapon was never conclusively recovered, but investigators had more than enough proof to proceed. Between Amber's own admission, forensic findings, and the documented history of stalking, prosecutors had a solid case. For Beverly's family, the confession confirmed their worst fears, that the woman they loved had been killed by someone she once trusted, despite every effort to protect herself. For the state of Missouri, it was now a matter of presenting that evidence before a jury. Amber McLaughlin was formally charged with capital murder, a crime that carried the ultimate penalty under Missouri law. Trial and sentencing. Amber McLaughlin's trial began in 2006, nearly 3 years after the murder of Beverly Guenther. Prosecutors presented a case built on overwhelming evidence. Amber's own confession, the restraining order, the pattern of stalking, and the forensic proof that tied her directly to the crime scene. The prosecution described Beverly's murder as premeditated and deliberate. They emphasized how Amber had been lying in wait outside Beverly's workplace and pointed to the history of harassment that had forced Beverly to seek court protection. The defense, however, painted a very different picture. They described Amber as a deeply troubled person, shaped by a childhood of abuse, trauma, and untreated mental illness. They presented evidence of depression, intellectual disabilities, and brain damage from past injuries. Their argument was not to excuse the crime, but to convince the jury that her mental health struggles should be considered in sentencing. The jury ultimately found Amber McLaughlin guilty of first-degree murder. But when it came time to decide her sentence, the panel reached a deadlock. Under Missouri law, if a jury cannot reach a unanimous decision on punishment, the judge has the authority to decide. In this rare and controversial outcome, the judge imposed the death penalty. Amber McLaughlin was officially sentenced to die by lethal injection. This judicial sentencing became one of the most debated aspects of the case. Critics argued that a life or death decision should rest only in the hands of a unanimous jury, not a single judge. Supporters countered that the law had been properly applied and that the brutality of the crime warranted the ultimate punishment. From that moment, Amber McLaughlin was placed on death row, beginning what would become nearly 2 decades of appeals, petitions, and pleas for clemency. Life on death row. After the judge sentenced her death in 2006, Amber McLaughlin was transferred to Missouri's death row, where she would spend the next 17 years awaiting execution. During this time, Amber began living openly as a transgender woman, adopting the name Amber while incarcerated. Though she had identified with her gender identity privately for years, her transition became more visible during her time behind bars. This added a unique dimension to her case, drawing attention from advocacy groups who argued for fair treatment of transgender inmates within the prison system. Life on death row was marked by long stretches of isolation, appeals, and the slow passage of time. Her attorneys continued to raise arguments about her mental health, pointing to documented brain damage, intellectual disabilities, and a history of severe childhood abuse. They argued that these factors should have barred her from receiving a death sentence. By late 2022, her case had gained international attention. Human rights groups, mental health advocates, and LGBTQ+ organizations pleaded for her life to be spared, framing her as both a convicted killer and a victim of lifelong trauma. They also criticized the unusual way she was sentenced by a judge after a jury deadlock. Still, on December 27, 2022, Missouri Governor Mike Parson denied her request for clemency, stating, "McLaughlin's crime was horrific, and she showed no remorse." The state of Missouri will carry out McLaughlin's sentence according to the court's order. With that decision, her fate was sealed. The date of execution was set for January 3, 2023, at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. For nearly 2 decades, Amber McLaughlin's case had lingered in appeals. Now her final days on death row were numbered. Final meal and last words. On January 3, 2023, Amber McLaughlin awoke to her final day at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri. Like others before her, she was given the choice of a special last meal. Her request was modest, a McDonald's combo meal, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. As the evening approached, Amber was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses later described her demeanor as quiet and nervous, but also resigned to her fate after nearly 2 decades on death row. When asked if she had any final words, Amber did not deliver a lengthy speech. Instead, her statement was short and direct. She expressed remorse for her actions, apologized for the pain she had caused, and said she hoped for peace for Beverly Guenther's family. At 6:51 p.m., the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, Amber McLaughlin was pronounced dead at the age of 49. Her execution was not only a moment of closure for Beverly Guenther's loved ones, but also a historic first. The execution of the first openly transgender woman in U.S. history. Aftermath and reflection. The execution of Amber McLaughlin on January 3, 2023, was more than the conclusion of a nearly 20-year legal battle. It was a moment that reignited national and international debates about the death penalty, mental health, and the rights of transgender inmates in America. For Beverly Guenther's family, Amber's execution brought long-awaited closure. They had endured 2 decades of grief, knowing Beverly's final moments were filled with fear and violence. For them, justice had finally been carried out, even though no sentence could ever undo their loss. For others, Amber's case raised difficult questions. Critics pointed to the fact that her death sentence was imposed not by a unanimous jury, but by a judge after a deadlock. A practice legal in Missouri but rare and controversial. Advocates also highlighted her history of childhood abuse, intellectual disability, and severe mental illness, arguing that executing someone with such a background undermined the principles of justice. The case also carried historic weight, because Amber McLaughlin was the first openly transgender woman executed in the United States. Human rights organizations condemned the execution, not only because of her identity, but because they viewed her life story as evidence of systemic failure, abuse, untreated trauma, and the inability of the justice system to address root causes before it was too late. Governor Mike Parson, however, stood firm, stating that the crime was horrific, and that Beverly's family had waited long enough for justice. In the end, Amber's execution left a divided legacy. To some, it was the rightful punishment for a brutal crime. To others, it was a haunting reminder of how trauma, identity, and punishment intersect in America's justice system. Her story continues to spark questions that remain unresolved. Can a lifetime of suffering ever mitigate the ultimate sentence? Should mercy have a place, even when the crime is undeniable? Amber McLaughlin's case will be remembered not only for the brutality of her crime, but also for the larger debates it reignited. Debates that go far beyond one woman's life and death. Do not forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next.